Hello folks, and welcome to our final week of new material. We'll be covering chapters 15 and chapter 17, elections and voters. And here are our learning outcomes for the week. We'll define first order elections, plurality systems, and proportional systems. We'll define and discuss referendums, initiatives, and recalls. We'll describe controls imposed on elections in authoritarian regimes and their effect. We'll discuss partisan identification in an era of partisan de-alignment. We'll identify the impacts of socioeconomic status and religion on voter preferences, and we'll discuss elections in authoritarian states in the world today. Okay, some terminology related to elections. The idea of a first-order election means those political races that are at the top of the ticket, the most important ones. So to use the recent election in the United States, the 2020 election, the presidential election is the first order election, and it might influence elections further down the ballot, which we refer to as second order elections. So the energy around the presidential election might also influence which party makes advances in Congress, the House and the Senate at the federal level, or even state legislatures. If there's not a presidential race, it could be the election for governor or a gubernatorial election at the state level could be a first order election if there's not a presidential election in that cycle. We see this in other countries too. So if there's a wave, if there's a political party that is gaining in influence, gaining in strength, and there's a real question as to which party or which coalition of parties will control the parliament, that's going to motivate a lot of people to participate in the election as a whole, and that's going to influence other races. The electoral system that a country uses is going to impact the outcome. Is it a proportional system where if your party wins 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the parliament? Is it a winner-take-all system like the United States? That is, whoever wins that specific race for the legislative seat, even if it's not a majority, as long as they get more votes than the other candidates, they win. So the electoral system, this also includes the process of voting. This is going to change certainly between countries, and in the United States it actually varies between states, and the structure of the system will impact who ultimately wins. So as I mentioned before, the United States has a winner-take-all system. Another way to put this is a single-member plurality, which means each district have one representative. So if you look at it like in the United States, you live in a congressional district, you have one congressperson that represents you, and that person is whoever got the most votes in the election. Even if they didn't get a majority of votes, as long as they got more votes than any of the other candidates, they become your member of Congress. The same is true for your senator, the person who represents your state in the Senate. Whoever gets the most votes for that. Likewise, when it comes to selecting the governor. Now, many of you already realize that when it comes to selecting the President of the United States, we don't have one national election. We have 51 elections, every American state plus the District of Columbia, and each one of those is awarded a certain amount of votes in the Electoral College. But each one of those, actually with the exception of two, are single-member plurality elections. They're winner-take-all. So in Minnesota, we have 10 electoral votes for the President of the United States. You either get all 10 or none if you're running for the presidency of the United States. It is winner take all. You either win or lose, and you don't need a majority to do that. Now, most other countries don't run that way. Most other democracies run on some version of proportional representation. That is, if your political party gets 25% of the votes, you get 25% of the seats in parliament. And if no single party gets a majority of the seats in parliament, then they need to work with other political parties to form a coalition that represents the majority and name a government. And we've discussed this in the past when we talked about legislatures. As I stated before, different countries have different systems for administering elections, and they vary quite a bit, and ultimately they impact who wins. Some countries have two-round systems where if one candidate doesn't get a majority of votes in the first round, it is limited to the top two candidates, and there is a second round election. There is a runoff election is another way to put it. The United States is really the only country in the world that uses this electoral college system, and it's highly controversial, as I'm sure you know, in the United States, because it creates the condition where somebody can win the popular vote, they win more votes than the other candidate, but might end up losing the election. And there are reasons for that. If those of you who want to get into that more, I hope you'll consider taking my American politics class sometime. There's historical reasons that we've developed an electoral college. But nonetheless, it's highly controversial. So spend a little time with this table in your reading and comparing the different presidential election systems that we see around the world. Another area of voting is referendums, initiatives, and recalls. These are forms of direct democracy where citizens will directly vote on a policy issue, or they will vote to include, or they will start a procedure to include a specific policy issue on the ballot. So an example of this is many states recently in the United States have passed laws that allow for recreational marijuana. The first step in that process would be an initiative process in many American states where if they get a certain amount of signatures, then the policy question goes on to the ballot. Then you have the referendum. Then citizens decide whether or not they want to allow for recreational marijuana in that state and how it'll be taxed and that sort of thing. A recall is a similar process where you get a certain amount of signatures to determine whether or not there should be a question on the ballot about removing an elected official. We also have this at the state level in the United States. We don't have this at the federal level. In all of these areas, we have referendums, initiatives, and recalls at the state level in the United States. We don't have them at the federal level. Other countries do offer these at the federal level, and there are some comparative graphs in your text that demonstrate where these are used and where they're not used. Now here is that very graph, and you'll see that the United States is not indicated on here because we do not use referendums, initiatives, and recalls at the federal level. We do use them at the state level in the United States. Elections do happen in authoritarian states, and in fact, they're quite useful for authoritarian leaders for the reasons that are mentioned here. And I won't go one by one. But most countries in the world, most authoritarian states also have elections, but they're much more controlled, obviously, by the authoritarian leadership. You know, the goal is to try to create a facade of democracy, but yet at the same time have a heavy hand in terms of controlling the outcome. So spend some time in your reading, make sure you understand the usefulness of elections in authoritarian regimes, and how authoritarian leaders make use of election processes to grant themselves greater legitimacy, engage the population, but at the same time do so in a way that does not ultimately question or undermine their leadership. Okay, we'll move on to a discussion of voters and what influences voting decisions and party identification. Historically in the United States, social class had a lot to do with party identification, what political party you associated yourself with. If you were more of an economic elite, social elite, you'd be more likely to identify with the Republican Party until a generation or so ago. And likewise, if you were poorer, if you were from rural America or poorer inner city America, you'd have been more likely to identify as a Democrat. We don't see that as much recently. Social class is not as predictive of party identification in the United States as it once was. So you have people who are, are higher in terms of socioeconomic status in both political parties and lower in socioeconomic status in both political parties. The big division in the United States has become between urban America, rural America, coastal America, and the interior. So again, when I refer to the term party identification, we're talking about a long-term attachment to a political party And that provides a filter for seeing the world politically. We've experienced a period over the last several decades of what we refer to as partisan de-alignment, lower levels of party identification. So in Minnesota, for example, if you ask people what political party they're a member of, the largest number don't say Democrat or DFL or Republican. They say independent. So that's the number one identification in Minnesota, for example, and that's an indication of broader partisan de-alignment. This is the weakening of bonds between voters and political parties. And for this, there's a lot of reasons why we're seeing partisan de-alignment, and we'll continue on in this discussion in the remaining slides. To continue on with this discussion of partisan de-alignment, some of the reasons that we see this, as I mentioned before, we see a breakdown in the association between socioeconomic status, class, and party identification. So that's one of the reasons. We see higher levels of overall education and higher education in the United States, people with college degrees, and therefore many of these individuals are interpreting political information themselves rather than seeing it through through the lens of a particular political party. We're seeing much more diversification, so individuals are drifting away from political parties and focusing more narrowly on interests, on issues that they care about. Funding for political parties has weakened in recent years. So that's what we see in the United States and globally. So political parties are not as powerful financially as they were. In the United States, one of the reasons we saw a weakening of political parties and party identification until somewhat recently was that there was a lot of convergence between the two political parties, especially when it came to matters of foreign policy, economics, trade. There was a lot of overlap between the Republicans and the Democratic Party. Now that changed dramatically during the Trump years, and we'll see if that reverts back, where there was sort of a Washington consensus when it came to free trade, a Washington consensus when it came to isolating Russia and other foreign policy strategies. That was that changed quite a bit during the Trump years. We'll see if that policy convergence returns. And then just broad disillusionment with the party structure, lower levels of trust in political parties and government as a whole. Some of this was related to specific scandals and instances of corruption that led voters to distrust political parties more than they had in the past. So what impacts the decisions of voters? As I mentioned before, social class has an impact, but that impact has been eroding. Religion has an impact, particularly in the United States. It's declining in other countries to some degree, but we see a close relationship between partisan decisions in the United States and religion. So if you were to tell me, for example, how much you made per year, that wouldn't tell me a whole lot about how you're likely to vote in the next election. But if you regularly attend church, then that's going to give me a much better idea. It's going to be much more predictive of the kind of decisions that you'll make in voting and what party that you'll support. Specific issues, of course, are very important when it comes to voter decisions. Taxes, benefits are important. And then, of course, we have large social issues, particularly in the United States. Gun safety versus expanded gun rights, reproductive freedom versus more limitations on abortion, and so forth. The economy, obviously, is always a force. Usually incumbents, people who are currently in office, are much more likely to stay in office if the economy is in good shape. It's not always decisive, but it's clearly measurable and has a positive relationship with with maintaining power if the economy is in good shape. And for that reason, political leaders tend to get a lot of credit when the economy is going well, perhaps much of which is not their direct responsibility, but they get credit when it's going well. And likewise, they get a lot of blame when it's not going well. Economies, particularly in the United States, are very diverse, so it's really hard to blame the state of the economy or credit the state of the economy on one person, even if it's the President of the United States. But still, they get a lot of credit and a lot of blame, depending on how things are going. And of course, leader personalities. This is something that we debate a lot. How important is the individual personality of the leader? This can be very easily exaggerated, and this is something that's often built into the narrative, the story we tell about an election after it happened. So this candidate lost because they had this personality trait versus other factors. It's always difficult to tell. Again, in many situations, a leader is selected democratically because they fit the broader mood. An example of this might be that, if Adolf Hitler hadn't won election when he did, another extremist would have won, or another extremist would have come to power, because the social conditions of Germany at that time was seeking that form of leadership. Now, that might be an oversimplification, but we do tend to see that there's something that the leaders that ultimately win are driven by broader societal forces, yet we often will kind of focus on their individual personality, their personality characteristics. As I mentioned, particularly in the United States, religiosity, regular church attendance, that's highly predictive in voting behavior. Likewise, on the other end of the spectrum, if you are more secular, or you see a society that is more secular, that's also going to impact political decisions, on a number of social issues. So when you hear that term secularization, you're talking about a declining space occupied by religion. And in some parts of the world, some parts of Europe, you're seeing increased secularization. But in other parts of the world, you're seeing higher levels of religiosity. We see that in the United States. We see that in much of the Muslim world, for example. An issue voter is somebody who's focused on a specific issue, and there's one dominant policy issue that is motivating their vote. So one example in the United States are gun rights voters. In many cases are an issue voter, in some cases a single issue voter that will vote on that issue. Historically, one of the reasons why gun rights have advanced over the last 20 or 30 years is because even people who may not, those people who might support greater limitations on gun rights or more gun safety policies, they're not one issue voters. That's one issue they care about, but they might care about 3 or 4 issues more importantly than that. Whereas many gun rights voters or activists, that is their top issue, and they'll vote entirely on that issue. And it's one of the reasons why we tend to see, even though there's a majority of the population that might favor more gun restrictions, we tend to see much more motivation and mobilization of gun rights voters. And we explored that when we talked about interest groups earlier in the semester. You've also got the issue of vote buying, where parties and candidates provide clear material benefits in return for support. You support me, here will be a generous public program that you can count on. And so in certain systems, we refer to this as vote buying, but there's always that, that tension. Support me, we can have more generous programs than if you supported the other candidate. Voter turnout is obviously a critical issue. What percentage of eligible voters actually participate? In the recent election in the United States, we had a historically high level of voter participation. So I think everyone recognized that the stakes were particularly high in the 2020 election. And obviously that's not always the case during times where we're not going through a health crisis, an economic crisis, people might not see the stakes as being quite so significant. Here's a comparison of voter turnout around the world, and this is impacted by a lot of things. Some of these are more authoritarian or hybrid systems, some are full and flawed democracies, but we can see that there's a lot of variation in turnout. Now, Australia, which is at the top there when it comes to voter turnout, one of the reasons they lead the world is because they have a compulsory voting system. That is, that it is required by law that you participate in elections. That's something I want you to think about this week, whether or not you support that. Now, no, you don't get thrown in jail if you don't go vote, but you do get a fine if you don't participate in elections. And obviously in the United States, we don't have that. You can participate or not participate, and non-participation is a right as well. It might be a way that you express yourself saying, hey, I don't like my choices here. But anyway, take a look at this and compare the two of them, and then recognize that the structures around voter turnout depend on election policies. You know, how easy do you make it to register? Can you vote by mail? Is it mandatory to vote? These are all policies that are going to impact who actually participates in elections. This goes over what I was just saying there. You know, do you have compulsory voting? Do you have automatic registration? Are you able to vote by mail? These are all factors. Now, characteristics of voters that lead to higher participation. Older voters tend to vote at a higher level. Well-educated voters vote at a higher rate. Married voters, higher income, employed. These are all factors that lead to higher levels of participation. And it probably makes sense too, because and many of them are related. So if you are lower income and you're struggling to put food on the table, and you're working 2 or 3 jobs, and you have kids, and you're taking public transportation to get where you need to go, you're probably not going to prioritize participating in an election where you're just barely getting by. Whereas if you are a partner at a law firm and it's easy for you to walk out of the office and go vote, and perhaps vote during the day, that's another thing, is how easy do you make it to vote outside of the designated day for an election? So the United States having its election on the first Tuesday of November in even years, that makes it very hard for people who might need to work during more traditional business hours. That's why some people have suggested that perhaps we should have a national holiday to participate in elections, because many people are required to be at work during that time. Now, by law, they should be allowed to take a break to vote, but how easy is that? Are they going to have to take 2 buses to get back home, vote, and then get back to work? So hopefully you'll think about some of these constraints, because they really do make a big difference into who participates in elections and ultimately who wins. How easy do we make it? How hard do we make it? And which groups are more impacted by the restrictions that are there? Okay, to summarize our elections reading, no electoral system's perfect. They all fall short in the goal of translating votes into actual seats and representing the will of the voter. But, you know, any human activity is imperfect. So even though there may be imperfections in any electoral system, it's far better than the alternative, which is, you know, a lack of voters and citizens making decisions. Legislative and executive elections are going to differ in their mechanics and their implications. Of course, in some countries that are more parliamentary systems, proportional, the executive emerges from the legislature. And as we've discussed in the United States, we have winner-take-all elections, whereas many countries, if a party gets 25% of the votes, they get 25% of the seats in the legislature. And then together they need to cooperate and form a coalition with other political parties to name a government and a prime minister. Elections are important learning opportunities to voters. They clarify the major issues and whether or not there's a popular mandate for a specific course of action. We often see a narrative develop after an election, so if we take a look at 2016 in the United States, it was the, support for Trump and the fact that President Trump won, even though he was not favored to win that election. In 2020, we saw President Trump not win re-election, so the political narrative was a national rejection of President Trump. But both of those are probably overstated narratives. They were relatively close elections, both in 2016 and 2020. They were both decisive elections. It didn't come down to one or two or even three states. But they were pretty close, and if they had gone the other way, we would have had a much different narrative, even though the number of votes separating the two candidates and the number of votes in the Electoral College were not particularly great. So, it's just something to keep in mind that we tend to overstate the narrative of a particular election. Now, the 2008 election, when President Obama came to power, you saw widespread support for not only President Obama, but the Democratic Party. They picked up majorities in both the House and Senate, and they did very well at statewide elections all across the country. So then you can start to make an argument of a mandate, of a clear narrative. But the last couple elections since then have been much more muddled, and they don't give us a real clear narrative with regard to what the election was all about. Hopefully you understand the concepts of referendums, initiatives, and recalls. These are examples of direct democracy. And a question that comes out of this is, how much democracy is too much? So should individual voters be making policy decisions? Are they in the best positions to do so? Is it a way for our elected leaders to avoid responsibility for making the tough decisions? So do think a little bit about their role and what you think about that. And of course, as I mentioned before, in the United States, we see these at the state level. We don't really see these at the federal level in the United States. Now, there are curbs on elections in authoritarian regimes, but we still see elections in the vast majority of authoritarian regimes to create the illusion of choice. The authoritarian leadership's thumb is definitely on the scale, but there are meaningful choices in a way that there weren't in the past. And regarding our chapter on voters, party identification is a key concept that we need to understand. What leads to higher levels of party identification? And of course, in the United States and other Western democracies over the last several generations, we've seen a decline in party identification. In the United States, more people identifying as independents, as not being aligned with a particular party. And this gets into that concept of partisan de-alignment. That is, individuals moving away from political parties. Social status is less important when it comes to party identification in recent decades, as we discussed earlier, although religion continues to play an important role in voting behavior, and in the United States we see a growing role. So church attendance, level of religiosity is much more predictive when it comes to voting behavior than socioeconomic status or wealth. There are lots of factors that explain voter choices. Some of them could be more single issue voting behavior, like gun rights versus greater gun safety regulations, pro-choice, pro-life. These would be, kind of dominant issues. But of course, the broader state of the economy is an important factor, and the personality of individual leaders, and which leaders are seen as more generally likable. These things all vary, and it can be difficult to tease out what's the more dominant. We've seen a general decline in overall turnout in Western democracies, but taking a look at 2020, at least in the United States, with the stakes being as high as they are, with the pandemic crisis, the dramatic differences between President Trump's Republican Party and Joe Biden's Democratic Party that led to very clear choices, high levels of voter turnout. In fact, the highest numbers of voters participating in that election in American history. Yes, there are voting. Yes, there are elections, as I just mentioned, in authoritarian states. But voting patterns in authoritarian states demonstrate more the motivations of the ruler than they do the voters, because the process is so controlled. Okay, here's your guiding questions for our final week of new material. You know the drill by now: 1 substantial original post and at least 2 responses to the on-topic posts of your classmates. Again, this is the last opportunity to improve that participation grade. I'm going to have your final scores for participation posted next week, so you'll have that information going into the final exam. We won't have a weekly quiz this week. That material is going to be covered on the final exam. About 1/3 of the questions on the final are going to come from this last week of material. So do spend a lot of time focusing on that and watching the film clip for this week too. That's also fair game. It's been wonderful working with you this semester. Please reach out to me with any questions or concerns, or if I could be of any help to you down the road.